The cubs were now exactly 1 year old, and judging by the frequency of the kills, assisted Pippa in the hunts. Ever since I had left Meru 3 months earlier, the cubs had been often rested a little way off from Pippa. The distance now increased to a quarter of a mile, and often the family were united only during mealtimes. The men were therefore not surprised at seeing Pippa along the following morning, but were puzzled as to why she did not help them to find the cubs. During the half hour in which they searched every bush and called, she showed no concern but dozed under a tree, and when at last the men located the cubs more than 400 yards from her, they seemed quite indifferent to Pippa's presence, although they soon joined together for feeding. I was amused to read how Tiny stole the meat from his big brother and got away with it. I could hardly believe that Tiny was no longer the timid, gentle runt, but now challenged everybody fearlessly just for the fun of it. I was also surprised to learn that he and Big Boy had recently become aware of the attraction of the female of the species and took turns flirting with Somba. She seemed to enjoy their affectionate lickings and playful teasings until their antics got too rough. Then she escaped to Pippa, who watched over the growing independence of her children. She was obviously loosening her maternal ties, but when there was the slightest sign of danger, she never left the cubs. So when the next morning the men found leopard spoor mixed up with the pugmarks of the family, and also identified Uga's pugmarks by his malformed toe, they knew that they were again in for a long search. During the days following, the cheetah appeared and disappeared. Most of the time, the whereabouts of the family could only be traced by their spoor. One day, it led through a belt of bush onto vast plains toward Murera. This attractive river had recently been made accessible to visitors by the Gola circuit, which, starting at Leopard Rock, followed along its palm-covered banks for about 10 miles, then crossed into arid scrub country, which was alive with gerenuk, rhino, buffalo, giraffe, eland, zebra, grunt, and more dik-dik than anywhere else inside the park, until it reached the Rojaveru and continued along it for some miles to Kenmare, including the road which connected to Lodge with Leopard Rock and passed by my camp. The circle covered 35 miles. The cheetah had recently frequented the area because of many smaller antelopes such as dik-dik, tiger, and grunt that lived there. While the men were tracking the spoor, they were not surprised to see vultures circling close to the Gola circuit. Walking in their direction to investigate, a black-maned lion got up some 100 yards in front of them. Unaware of the party behind him, he also followed the vultures until he came within 50 yards of the kill. Ben then saw Pippa and the cubs get up and dash off. He called out, and startled by his voice, the lion bolted. Pippa instantly chased him off for good. A few minutes later, the family reunited at the remains of a gravy zebra foal. It could not have been more than a month old. Nevertheless, it was interesting that the cheetah had tackled the young of such big animals, risking the powerful kicks of the mother. There was nothing left of a carcass for men to recover for the next day's meal, so they left the family to sleep off their bulging bellies. In spite of the feast, which was the third kill a week, when the men located them, the following morning the cheetah were again on a hunt. Pippa was high up in a tree and had spotted a herd of grunt. To get a better look, She climbed another tree and watched the gazelles for a long time. She then jumped to the ground, called the cubs, and with Somba at her side, Tiny 50 yards behind, and Big Boy still farther back, they crept through the grass, taking careful advantage of the smallest scrap of cover until they were close. Unfortunately, Somba showed herself too soon, and that was the end of the hunt. To compensate the hungry family, Ben fed them the meat he had brought along until Pippa retreated to a shady tree. The cubs played around a little and wanted to join her, but she moved off immediately to another lair. A short while later, Somba and Tiny made another attempt to rest with her. Again, Pippa left the minute the cubs sat down. Meanwhile, Big Boy, fighting himself, deserted cold. His voice was still breaking, and his throat sounded very sore. Tiny rushed hurriedly back to keep him company, while Somba succeeded in snuggling up to Pippa. 2 days later, the family were luckier and killed a young water bug. I was relieved and proud that Pippa and her cubs now killed frequently, but was terrified when Ben wrote that a gang of poachers had recently been operating right inside the park and had killed rhino, leopard, and 3 cheetah. For some time we had lost track of Whitey, Billy, and Tatu, and I was tormented by the fear that one of them might have fallen victim to the poachers. My method of identifying Pippa's cubs by the individual patterns of tail root spots could be now the greatest value, and I asked Ben to recover, if possible, the skins of the dead cheetah. Later, I learned that the poachers had cut up the pelts before they were arrested. The news about Pippa and her present leader continued to be excellent. The brothers seemed devoted to each other and almost inseparable. Tiny was by now the equal of Big Boy and spent a great part of his time climbing trees, at which he excelled Somba, who only climbed occasionally, while Big Boy hardly ever joined in this game. Big Boy was already taller at the shoulders than Pippa, with Tiny not quite as large as she, and Somba the smallest of the lot. The family moved on an average 1 to 2 miles a day and rarely slept at the same place twice. Although Pippa spent most of her resting time apart from the cubs, she never deserted them for a full day, at least as far as could be judged from their spoor. On August 24th, the men located the cubs closer to the road, halfway between the camp and mile 5. A few minutes later, Pippa appeared, with a female Kongoni following her slowly. The hartebeest was at times within 5 yards of Pippa, who would then lie down, while the Kongoni stopped. As soon as Pippa got up to advance toward the antelope, it would move back a step or two. This strange procession continued until a young Kongoni fawn suddenly emerged from the grass about 30 yards from Pippa, who instantly ran after it, and after about 60 paces brought it down by placing her paw on its back. She then grabbed its throat and held on to its windpipe. Meanwhile, the mother tried to defend her young, and for a moment it looked as though Pippa might have to let it go, but Somba succeeded in driving the Kongoni away. She chased her for about 300 yards, by which time the fawn was dead. When the mother returned and realized the tragedy, she put up no resistance, and after Somba had chased her off a second time, she did not come back. It had taken Pippa 2 minutes to suffocate the little fawn, helped by Big Boy and Tiny, who started eating it before it was dead. In 45 minutes there was nothing left other than the head and leg bones. It was the first time any of us had witnessed the actual killing of a prey, let alone the teamwork between Pippa and her cubs to make it a success. When Ben measured the distance over which the hunt had taken place, he learned that from her standing position Pippa had chased 60 paces to catch the escaping calf, which had run 30 paces. Thus she had covered twice the distance the calf had in the same time. This was the sixth kill made by the family within 24 days. During the next 9 days, the family made 4 more kills, 2 young waterbuck and a gerenuk, and a last kill only known by their full bellies and blood-covered faces. Despite all this splendid news, I became increasingly depressed in England. The strain of living in London after having been used to unlimited space and an outdoor life was more than I could take, especially during the summer months. Fortunately, I had some very good friends in Surrey, with whom I later stayed, and their wonderful hospitality and beautiful gardens helped me through a most trying period. I traveled daily for an hour on overcrowded trains into London, and then by still more stuffy underground to Kensington, where I had my physiotherapeutic treatment. Walking the last part through Hyde Park to my destination, I often hummed the little tune which I sang whenever I wanted the cheetah to follow me. Pippa, Pippa, Pippalunka, and the little capsule, come on, come on, come on, come on. I imagined the Sinwai, graceful animals moving beside me to the rhythm of this song, and often, when I was hanging on to anything firm in a full bus and bumping against my standing neighbors, I daydreamed of resting close to the family and feeling their bodies shaking by their contented purrs. I was most interested in learning how the Whipsnade Zoo in Bedfordshire had succeeded in breeding cheetah, and as soon as I could I visited it. Here the animals are not caged. The director kindly let me read the files of Juanita, who up to date had borne 2 litters of 1 male and 2 females. From this I learned that of the first litter, born in 1967, 2 of the cubs soon died of osteodystrophic lesions, and the surviving cub was still very ill. The second litter, born July 1968, was now exactly 1 year old and thriving. I found these cubs huddled together in the center of a comparatively small paddock which contained a bushy tree with branches which, however, were too thin to carry the weight of a cheetah. At the far end was a wooden shelter adjoining a small enclosure where the sick cheetah of the first litter rested. Except for their sleeping hut, there was no place for the cubs to hide in or climb up. They had been moved from a large compound to this small place so the visitors could see them all the time. Knowing how dependent Pippa's families were on exercise, privacy, and concealment, I wondered if these cubs would ever breed. The 3 cheetah at the Regent's Park Zoo in the center of London were much worse off. Each had a tiny enclosure with a wooden hut in a corner and pebble ground, which of course was easier to clean than grass but unnatural to a cheetah. They could rub their noses through the wire or face leopards, lions, and tigers in their compounds across a narrow path which from visitors could compare the various cat species. Seeing the indifference of the cheetah to the lions and leopards, I realized again how much wild animals are bound to suffer in order to adapt their instincts to an artificial life in which they lose their fear or even their most dreaded enemies. It was a rainy, cold afternoon, and one of the cheetah shivered more than a normal reaction to the bad weather would have warranted. When a new cloud burst drenched it. The animal looked miserable but remained immobile instead of going inside its hut for shelter as his friends did. I called the keeper and asked if this cheetah were ill, but he said there was nothing wrong with the animal except that it would not use the hut because it dislikes the smell of its recent occupant. Looking at the rain-loaded sky, I suggested that the hut should be changed, but was assured that nothing could be done until the next day when the head keeper would be there. I insisted that at least a temporary shelter be put to give it the sick animal protection from a rain, and waited until this was done. How could a cheetah feel relaxed under such conditions, let alone mate and breed? I had a long talk with the director in which I stressed that exercise and privacy were far more important for cheetah than for other cats. I pointed out that Pippa's territory in Merry Park was 63 square miles in which she roamed freely with her cubs. Since no zoo could ever provide sufficient space to satisfy a cheetah, and since it was not their function to conceal the animals from visitors, it seemed risky and a waste of time and money to try to breed cheetah in captivity, which would in any case only produce more pets or zoo exhibits. If one could breed these sensitive animals under natural conditions, Pippa had proved that this could be done, and up to now she had born in 4 litters 15 cubs, of which 6 were still alive. Since Pippa was barely 5 years old and the lifespan of cheetah is approximately 15 years, she could be expected to triple the number of surviving cubs to 18, which would all go on breeding and thus restock the bush with wild-born cheetah. I further urged that because cheetah are second on the list of endangered animals, no time should be lost in building up a healthy survival number in the areas in which the animals could go on breeding. I also visited the Norfolk Wildlife Park, where Philip Ware was successfully breeding pheasants, European lynx, and other animals. He is the chairman of the Conservation and Breeding Committee of Great Britain and Ireland, and so was interested in any method which might save threatened species. From him I learned that although it was the aim of his society to breed endangered animals within their natural habitat, up to date this had been achieved only with the European eagle owl. They were reintroduced to Germany and Sweden, where they had become extinct. The possibility of breeding mammalian predators, and in particular the great cats of Africa, under natural conditions was, he believed, at present still a utopian ideal. I then pointed out that Elsa and Pippa had already proved that such an utopian ideal could be realized, and suggested that if this, the greatest of predators, could thus be saved, saving the rest of the endangered mammals would be comparatively easy, provided one could be raise the necessary funds and find people to do the work. The more I realized how urgent it was that this new method of breeding endangered animals under natural conditions should be known and put into practice, the more frustrated I became at having to spend so long in England and thereby miss most important last few months of my association with Pippa and her cubs. In particular, I was interested to know whether the 2 males would leave Pippa sooner than Somba, and whether they might all become sexually attracted to each other. Meanwhile, I had to undergo a most complicated operation, which needed all the skill of the best surgeon in that field. During the time I was in a hospital, a nurse brought me a catalogue promoting a forthcoming exhibition of some of my paintings showing the Kenya Africans in their traditional costumes. This was a great surprise for me. As soon as I was mobile again, I visited it, and then, during the months that my paintings were on view, helped in various ways to make the show successful. The exhibition coincided with the publication of my book on Pippa, the Spotted Sphinx, and I was glad to be able to help up with its promotion. Too, even though this entailed almost daily interviews, broadcasts, and TV appearances, I also worked on the editing of a children's book, Pippa, the Cheetah and Her Cubs, as well carrying on negotiation with various film companies to produce as a TV program the movie footage which I had accumulated during the 4 years I had lived with the cheetah. The force that drove me to undertake all this way my wish to support the Elsa wild animal appeal, which was the benefit from these activities. In addition, I had meetings with my London trustees and carried on correspondence with the directors of the Elsa Wild Animal Appeal in the United States. All this would certainly keep me busily occupied until October, which was the time estimated by my doctor as necessary for my completion of my treatment. Chapter 9. Pippa between life and death. In spite all of this activity, like the proverbial drop that erodes the hardest rock, my craving worries about Pippa and her cubs finally became so unbearable that I suddenly broke off all further treatment, cancelled my engagements, and took the first plane back to Kenya. I arrived in Nairobi on September 7th. I had to wait there for 3 harassing days before Ben turned up to drive me to Meru. He said the cheetah had been missing during this time, as it had appeared from their spoor that Pippa had deserted the cubs. He had wanted to find the family before leaving for Nairobi. When on September 11th we at last drove into camp, we went straight off in search of the family, whom local had fed earlier in the day. But I had to wait until the morning before I spotted people coming from Gambo Plain to the road near the new headquarters the next day. She purred instantly when I walked up to her, and licking my hand and rubbing her silky head against me, seemed as happy as I was. Meanwhile, the cubs caught up with their mother. They had grown so much that I had difficulty in identifying them. All looked superbly fit. Big Boy and Tiny were much larger than Pippa and Somba, who were equal size. They were inquisitive enough, although they kept their distance and dodged at once if I made even the slightest move towards them. I asked Ben to fetch the meat and milk from camp, and then walked with the cheetah a few hundred yards off the road to settle near a fallen tree. The cubs immediately took possession of it, prodding each other from the best position on the branches, under which Pippa and I sat together. While I went on caressing her, she purred, and all the 4 long months of separation seemed forgotten by us both, but not by Somba. Edging carefully toward us, she settled at the other side of Pippa, as close to her as I was. I kept on stroking Pippa, partly to assure Somba that I was no danger to her mother, which Pippa's purring confirmed. Gradually Somba inched herself into such a position that I could not avoid stroking her when I stroked Pippa. Thus she kept on pretending not to be interested in me, but at the same time making friends. Big Boy and Tiny joined us. Tiny purred and looked at me for a long time with his dark, soft eyes, but the moment I moved my hand toward him, he rolled out of reach. Big Boy seemed indifferent to my patting him, but he never purred, so we sat all together, utterly content. I felt sublimely happy, as I could not have asked for a more wonderful welcome. When Ben appeared with the food, the cheetah were so thirsty that they nearly upset the milk before I could pour it into the bowl. Instantly, Somba and Tiny buried their heads in it, pushing Big Boy and Pippa away so that they had to lap from the water can. There was only a little meat left from the last goat, and even that was high. Despite this, the cheetah ate it all to the last scrap and wanted more, so Ben went to fetch a new goat. He told me that this might take some time since he had, at the warden's request, moved the herd on October 1st from Kenmare to Local's home outside the park. The distance was 22 miles, which made it difficult to have the meat available when it was needed. After he had left, the cubs started to play, chasing each other across the recently burned ground. They stirred up such clouds of ash that I could not take any photographs. I tried to join Pippa, who rested under a tree a short distance away, but when I approached her, she moved on, calling the cubs, and all walked off in the direction they had come from. Watching them disappear, I suddenly noticed that Pippa had a slight limp. Since Ben had taken the Land Rover to get a goat, Local and I had to walk to 3 miles home. By then it was midday and very hot. After plodding on for a while, I spotted the family through the field glasses. They were resting under the bush, licking each other and rolling onto their bags with their paws stretched up to catch the slightest breeze in the simmering heat. I was torn between a wish to spend the whole day with them and the risk that they might follow us back to camp if we joined them now. Hoping to act in their best interest, we made a long detour and, looking back repeatedly to see whether they were coming after us, I was glad to see that they were far too sleepy to move. When we arrived in camp at lunchtime, George was waiting for me. His news was sad. I knew already from his letters that he had had trouble with the park authorities about his lions, and now he had been asked to leave his camp. This was distressing enough, but even more so because of Sandy. The little cub had been seen on and off in the company of George Pride, but had on a few occasions turned up along near the camp, very hungry. Sandy was only 6 months old and far too young to survive alone. In hope of keeping an eye on her, at least from distance, George had suggested to the warden that he move into my camp and otherwise remain as a tourist in the park. He was now waiting for the warden's reply. His worries about Sandy had been his reason for not meeting me at the airport in Nairobi, and even now he was in a hurry to get home in case Sandy should show up at his camp.